Welcome to Labor on the Job. I'm the host, Steve Zeltzer. Tonight we're going to be looking at consciousness, ideas, and how thinking changes and how it comes about. And joining us is the author of a new book, The Hegemony of Common Sense, Wisdom and Mystification in Everyday Life, and the author is Dean Manders. Welcome to the show, Dean.
Thank you.
So, Dean, why did you write this book, and what brought you to do that?
Well, the first and most obvious reason is anyone who goes to graduate school who wants to teach needs to get a PhD. And to get a PhD, you have to write ultimately a book. So the original format for this book was my doctoral dissertation. But my intentions were much greater than simply trying to get my PhD. I decided that I wanted to answer two questions. And one was, why is the left in the United States so ineffectual, so weak? Why are they unable to translate their analysis into action? I needed to work through that for myself. The other reason is that if and when a left movement came about again, and that has seemed to have happened since 1999 with the WTO strike that started in Seattle and has now mushroomed the G8 right now as we speak. The demonstrations are quite huge. I wanted to write something that people on the left could refer to so they wouldn't make the same mistakes that the left made when I was involved in the student movement and the New Left of the 60s and early 70s.
Now, a lot of people ask, more in the United States, why is the United States so different from other countries as far as their ideology? Bush electing somebody like Bush, or their history, and it seems in this country that people don't have a history, or they don't have a consciousness of their history. So maybe you can talk about this idea of the United States and the development of ideas and thought in relationship to the development of the United States.
Certainly. I think I'd start off by quoting a line from Gore Vidal that I kind of like. He calls the United States of amnesia. And it is true, after teaching now for more than 30 years, my students have no conception of what happened 20 years ago, much less 200 or 2,000 years ago.
These are college students.
Yes, absolutely. It is discouraging on one hand and quizzical on the other hand. There have been many ideas put forward why the United States is different. The exceptionalism of the United States. I mean, there's the frontier hypothesis. There's the hypothesis that the United States has no feudal past, that we started as basically a mercantile capitalist society. There was no feudalism ever in the United States. There are several other explanations, none of which, in my mind, were totally convincing. I wanted to basically understand why people think what they think, which ultimately leads them to do what they do. So it's a question of what we call praxis. Thought and action fused together is praxis. And when I started to look at that, I found the most important source was not actually Turner, who talks about the frontier thesis.
And that was the idea that there was ever expansionism.
Yes,
people
right.
could get land in this country,
right.
and you had a future, and
that expansion would blunt all types of class conflicts and so on and so forth.
There are no class conflicts in this country.
Right, of course not. Right. That, of course, is nonsense. There are tons of class conflicts, as I'm sure you well know, and anyone knows who studies history. So those explanations were never very adequate. At some point in 68 or 69, I came upon an Italian Marxist by the name of Antonio Gramsci. And he started out as a socialist at the same time that Mussolini was a socialist. He then much to his later chagrin, formed and joined at the same time the Italian Communist Party, which he later regretted. He said he should have stayed with the Socialist Party. But be that as it may, by 1927, Gramsci had demonstrated the exact ability that the left in the United States had never demonstrated, and that is that he had found a way to speak to everyday normal people in a language that they could understand, that would not destroy or oversimplify ideas that need to be complex. He could explain these complexities in ways that everyday people could understand. And when I started to read Gramsci, I said, someone needs to apply this to the United States.
Well, what were some of the ideas that he was able to express in a popular way at that time that were important?
The most important of his ideas, and the most innovative idea of probably any Marxist of the 20th century, is the idea that he calls ideological hegemony. And this has to do with the maintenance of control, the maintenance of domination or dominance over population. Now, historically, that has been accomplished inefficiently by force. Repression breeds resistance. It's not good to beat people over the head. Sooner or later, they're going to get angry and beat you over the head. Gramsci explained that in the modern world, the 20th century, which he was basically talking about, class domination is effectuated more by the mystification of consciousness, the distortion, the obfuscation, the redirection of thought and ideas than through force or even the threat of force. Of course, force is always in the background. It's always there.
But an ideological barrage that people face, that they confuses them or distorts what's really going on. Is that
right? If you can mystify people, if you can get people to participate in their own subjugation, quote unquote, if you can get people to become their own worst enemies, you've won. And you've won without any police forces, military forces, or whatever. Now, if you look at the 20th century, there are periods of relative quiescence, and there are periods of relative, quote, for the moment, radical action, radical activity. In the periods of quiescence, the 50s would be a good example, outside of the South, where the civil rights movement is occurring during the 50s, and in Detroit, where Afro-Americans are entering the United Auto Workers in large numbers, and there's racist, ethnic conflict would be better, but we call it racist. That's occurring in the 50s. But if you weren't around those two areas, the 1950s would be remembered more for Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best and TV programs that none of my students now know. I have to use examples like The Simpsons or something like that.
But I mean, the history of the United States is so rich in struggles of the working class, mass struggles. Even the 1877, which is the 130th anniversary of the Great Railway Strike, a national strike of the United States, affected San Francisco. It affected many major cities in the United States, and yet people don't even know about it. I mean, it's like a mystery. It's like this hidden history.
Well, we are the most ahistorical nation, the most ahistorical culture that has probably ever existed. I think that's a fairly safe statement. But there are reasons why that occurs, and it has to do with the alienation of consciousness, which requires a certain amount of explanation on my part, which is possible. But let me finish my thought.
Okay.
And during the periods of quiescence, or relative quiescence, people were basically involved in, like after World War II, up until the death of Kennedy would be one of those periods, except for the Civil Rights Movement, Detroit. People were involved in creating families, moving to the suburbs if they could. They were involved in buying washing machines and dryers.
Consumerism.
Consumerism, basically, we call this the American dream, where happiness equals upward mobility, and more money is automatically what gives you happiness. Of course, people who do that find out in 30, 40 years that that's not so, but by that time they're trapped. They're long trapped. That period is a period where the dominant values of the people who ultimately own the multinational corporations, whom we call the capitalist class, their values, the values of consumption, the values of private enterprise, basically the rights of private ownership of income-producing property, all of those values, individualism, competition, the American dream, all those were very well inculcated among the population. And in that situation, the population basically controls themselves. That's the ideal situation. That's the quintessence of what Gramsci means by ideological hegemony. Now, how that is accomplished through something he calls common sense, which I hope to get into later. The other periods, if you look at the teens, where you have the American Socialist Party with Eugene Debs getting around 900,000 votes in 1912 by the ballot box. And you look at the 30s, which is quite militant, but in terms of the actual politics of the 1930s, while it's very militant, if you ask John Lewis, he would basically say that he was using the left. He was using, quote, communists.
He hired communists to
organize
in the
right.
CIO.
But
so
as soon as the unions were organized, he got rid of them, quote unquote. He used them kind of like a bird dog, quote. During those periods, the values of the dominant class are not so well developed, and in those periods, you will see that they will bring out the police forces to whatever extent that they need to do so.
But in the case of the 50s, for example, didn't that period of dominance come about because of a purge, the witch hunts, the hysteria that was created? At this time it's terrorism. That was a communism.
Well,
the communists are going to take over, and the fact that within the unions there were union officials that became part of that witch hunt to drive leftist militants out of the unions and create a kind of corporate type trade union movement. Wasn't that?
Absolutely. And I was going to document some of that.
You want to
later?
Well, okay, we can do it.
But see, I would take that one step even deeper, and that is that what I'm interested in is how is it that the left allowed itself to be put into that position where it could be so easily dispensed with, quote unquote. And the reason that that occurred, from my understanding of history, is that they followed a very Leninist, top-down party system, where you have a very few people who, quote, know the truth or understand, and everyone else is basically used as the arms and the legs. And if you cut off the head, the arms and the legs don't know what to do. It's that structure of the left organization itself that allowed, with the help of the repression of the state, undoubtedly true, with the help of McCarthy, undoubtedly true, but to say that it was only that is to basically let the left off the hook, and I'm unwilling to do that.
Well, what was Gramsci's idea? You say that one of the problems was centralization of the left in this country. What was Gramsci's idea as far as workers or the regular people, the common people? How would they organize themselves to confront this problem?
Gramsci basically would be in accord with Marx's writings about the Paris Commune in 1870, 1871, where everyday normal people took history into their own hands. They entered the historical stage and they made history themselves. History was not made by the Lenins or the Trotskys or the Maos. No, history was made by everyday normal people. Gramsci believed that for fundamental revolutionary transformation to take place, entire populations of people have to be involved. They have to understand the socialist, the feminist, the progressive goals that they are working to produce. If that knowledge is only held by a few people, and those few people then use other people as cylinders in an engine, the engine is going to basically sputter out, because that makes the organization vulnerable to the state. It can chop off the head and the engine stops. So he's very clear, and in this he's very close to some of Marx's writing. Sometimes Marx doesn't write like this, sometimes he does, that revolution, if it's going to occur, not only does revolution require dancing, quote unquote, revolution also requires that it be made consciously and concertedly by the people who make the revolution. It can't be made by someone else for you. You have to make it for yourself.
Well, the experience of the Paris Commune, of the working class and the small artisans and others taking over that society or the city and running it, is very far away from the present situation.
Extremely.
Of the American working class taking control of anything. And most people feel that basically they have no power. You have the Democrats and Republicans that offer no choices. Well, and there's a frustration. And of course the media says you're powerless. You can't do anything. It's leaders who will solve your problems.
Well, let me see how I explain this the way that I would do, the way that I do in my courses, is that I want to explain to people how the process of ideological hegemony actually, what is mystification? Not just to use the word, but to actually show them what it is, quote unquote. And it's not that difficult to do. I normally do it with a whiteboard or blackboard, but if we can imagine some columns, it's really quite simple. I mean, on one side, I'll pick 3 of the strongest virtues, values, cultural beliefs that are associated with the rise of the business class in their fight against the feudal aristocracy. This happened around the world, but primarily to understand the present situation, you'd have to go to Europe, because it's European feudalism that is the root of the system that dominates the planet today. Japanese feudalism is fascinating, extremely. Chinese feudalism, fascinating, extremely. But those systems are not the systems that the business classes ultimately rose to power, got rid of the aristocrats, and became the dominant class themselves. So 3 of these ideals, of course, one would be equality. I mean, this idea is not a new idea. Anytime you have a slave system, you have inequality. Or if you have inequality, you have equality. People know about it. All right. It was not a motivating factor for thousands of years. I mean, Aristotle talked about masters and slaves 2,500 years ago, easily. So the rising middle class, they're in between the aristocrats and the serfs and the peasants, the business class. They have this idea of equality. All men are created equal. Notice it's men. It took women hundreds of years to get some parity. They're still not completely there. But the idea of equality is central to their worldview. It is not central to the worldview of Louis XIV, Louis XV, Louis XVI. It's not central at all to any aristocratic worldview. All right, so that's one idea. Another idea would be democracy. Certainly not an idea that has any great popularity with any autocratic, aristocratic form of government. Not in any way, shape, or form. So we have equality, democracy, and then the last one that I would normally talk about, and I'd put it in a context to make it understandable, would be freedom. One of the most important dynamics in the lives of everyone on the planet Earth. On some level, there have been, in the 20th century, easily 80 to 100 million people die on one side or the other in regards to this idea of freedom, quote unquote. So what I normally do is I'll put that in a context, and this is where we would get into communism. momentarily. I say that I was taught that the United States defends freedom around the world. Isn't that what Bush constantly says he wants to bring to the people of Iraq? He wants to bring them freedom,
And,
quote
and
unquote.
democracy. We're bringing
And democracy, yes, and equality, so on and so forth. All right. So here are these three ideals, important, worth dying for, undoubtedly central. There's a flaw in each of them, which we'll get to, but they're very important. All right. So I say this is the rhetoric of the system. It's good rhetoric. It's important rhetoric. In fact, it's not just rhetoric. These values mean something. All right. So I put those up on the board. And then I say, now, on the other hand, let's look at what really is going on. Let's look at experienced reality. All right? Not what the system promises, but what the system delivers. And you have equality here, but over here, you have massive inequality. There's inequality everywhere. Some people live under cardboard boxes, right in here in the streets of San Francisco. Some people live in Bel Air. And many people in between. There are myriad levels and layers of inequality.
And the inequality is growing.
And it's growing. Income inequality, ethnic inequality, which we call racial inequality, is growing. Gender inequality has settled at a certain level, around 74, 76 cents on the dollar tops, and that's only for very few women. Most women get less. The point is that we have what is called a classic contradiction. You have a system that promises you equality, and the rising business class had to promise equality to the serfs and the peasants to get their help to defeat the aristocrats.
And wasn't that the case of the American Revolution?
Oh, of course. We're talking, I would call it the War of Independence. I mean, I wouldn't call it a revolution because the same people who ran this country before, I mean, while the English were the colonial masters, they were the same people who ran the country after the English left, quote unquote. And the class system didn't change. I would call it a war of national liberation or a war of independence.
Or self-determination for the United States.
Yes, yes. But yes, your point is definitely well taken. This is a classic contradiction. You have to basically promise people equality. You have to, because you need their help. I'm thinking the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. All right, you need their help to get rid of the aristocrats. You promise them equality. Then you don't give it to them. It doesn't happen. Well, they get pissed. They get upset. They get annoyed. But most people don't go to bed at night worrying about such things. I saw this at Berkeley. I see it at San Francisco State. I see it wherever I go. It doesn't keep people awake at night. It keeps me awake, but it doesn't keep most people awake. All right. So this is the classic notion of a contradiction, that in the process of offering or creating something that you have to do to get people's help, you create a situation that undermines the very thing that you're trying to accomplish.
Well, these contradictions in American society, which are rapidly growing, this oligarchy, I mean,
we're not done yet.
Yeah, okay, we're not done.
No, no.
So it creates divisions, and it raises the opportunity for people to say what's wrong. There are problems, and in the United States, the ideology, I mean, pragmatism, has been, if it works, it's okay, and
well,
that's.
You're stealing my thunder.
Okay.
I'm getting to that.
Okay, okay. I'll let you continue.
Thank you. I'm trying to document this as best I possibly can. If you look at democracy, the next value, the next ideal, the next piece of rhetoric on the list, not a difficult concept to understand. Democracy is having a say in the decisions that affect your life. Not a very difficult idea to comprehend. And the business class, fighting against the aristocrats, offered the serfs and the peasants democracy. Come live in what were called free cities in Europe, meaning that if you lived there a year and a day, and you got married and had a trade and you didn't get arrested, you could never be enserfed. You were free, quote unquote. And you have the idea of democracy being offered, being promised, for the same reason that equality was. You need people's help to get rid of the aristocrats. And then, my God, just look at this for the 20th century, but we could do this for the 19th century, we could do it for the 18th century, but the 20th century will be more, post-World War II 20th century will be more accessible to more people. Look at Watergate with Nixon. What in blazes does that have to do with democracy when you are bugging and you are you use plumbers, you use dirty tricks, you do everything you possibly can to undermine the democratic process? Right? It happened. It's real. Most people don't think about it very often, don't remember it, but it's very real. It's very true. In the 80s, you have Iran-Contra with Ronald Reagan, Oliver North. Very proudly, this lieutenant colonel of the Marine Corps standing up and saying, yes, I violated the Constitution. I mean, military officers are not to violate the Constitution, but he was very proud that he violated the Constitution. What does this have to do with democracy? That's a rhetorical question. Nothing. Zero. And then the real killer, the topper, is that in the year 2000, we did not elect a president. In the year 2000, the Supreme Court selected a president, George Walker Bush.
But I mean, is this really something new? Because looking, for example, in the 1800s or the 19th century, with Hayes, after the Civil War, you had a situation in the United States where the election was virtually rigged.
No, I said you could do this for the 18th or the 19th.
So there's a continuity.
Of course, I'm doing it.
You're updating it for this recent period.
I'm doing it in the hopes that more people will remember things that are more recent than farther back. I mean, I could talk about Boss Tweed and so on and so forth. But, you know, my goal normally is, as was Gramsci's, is to communicate.
To make it relevant.
Yes.
So people look at this.
To get through.
The rigged election.
Okay. Yes, right. And from everything that came out after the election, all the studies basically showed that Gore won. That Gore actually has been president, is president, but is not president. Now, what in blazes does this have to do with democracy? Nothing. Literally nothing. I mean, the people who fought in World War II to preserve democracy, my parents' generation, they're all turning over in their graves. I mean, there's a dark day, a black day for the United States. Here's another contradiction, massive contradiction. Again, people don't go to bed at night worrying about such things. Most people don't. All right, we're getting to the point where there must be something else, maybe a third column. There is. The last one is freedom, quote unquote, and freedom. We have a particular kind of freedom in the capitalist system, and that kind of freedom in philosophy we call it negative freedom, and it doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means that you are free when you're not controlled and you have choice. It's the absence of impediments to action and free choice. People are not told or even suggestions are not made to them what they ought to do when they're not controlled and what they ought to choose. That's left up to, quote, the individual, which means it's left up to consumerism, to the media, to advertising.
Or isn't it the propaganda in this country to become a capitalist, to become rich? I mean, this is like, I mean, if you're the goal.
It is, but I think a lot of people basically end up realizing the more common and the more usual outcome is that when the going gets tough, the tough go shopping. I mean, I think that's what normally they might have the haughty dreams for a while, but they don't last. All right, that does last. I mean, that's the sole potency allowed in corporate capitalism.
Isn't that what Bush said? Go shopping.
He did. He did once. Yes, he did. He didn't say when the going gets tough, the tough go shopping. But yeah, it's the same kind of idea. So here we have the United States defends freedom around the world. All right, and then you have reality. Oh my God, you have reality. I mean, this I could go on for hours. I won't. I'll simply state that as of the Spanish-American War, 1899, 1900, right in through there.
That's when we were bringing democracy to the Philippines, wasn't it?
Well, right, yes, of course. You have a good sense of humor. The United States has been an aggressor nation, all right? I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that the United States has been an aggressor nation. And at this point, I normally don't ask my students to believe me. I normally read a quote about the period from approximately 1900 to the beginning of World War II. And if you'll permit me, I will read this quote because it is so stunning. The first time I heard it, I almost passed out. This is a direct quote from Major General Smedley D. Butler. It comes from, of all things, a book called Common Sense, published in the 1930s. This is a direct quote. Major General, I think that's a two-star general, if I remember right, of the Marine Corps. Listen, this is amazing. He says, "I spent 33 years and 4 months in active service as a member of our country's most agile military force, the Marine Corps. I served in all commission ranks, from a second lieutenant to major general, and during that period, I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer for capitalism. Thus, I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American oil interest in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking house of Brown Brothers from 1909 through 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interest in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went its way unmolested. During those years, I had, as the boys in the back room would say, a swell racket. I was rewarded with honors, medals, promotions. Looking back on it, I feel I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 city districts. We Marines operated on 3 continents. And the same pattern is reproduced at the end of World War II. I could read the list. I don't think I need to. I'll simply give you a couple examples of more recent memory, and I'll bring back one that's more relevant today. 1973, Chile. The Chilean people have elected a Marxist and socialist president through the ballot box. No guns, no violence, just voting. They voted him in twice. His name was Salvador Allende. Well, Salvador Allende was going to basically give the resources that were being stolen by Anaconda Copper and Kennecott Copper, American multinational corporations, as well as ITT. He was going to nationalize those resources.
But those belonged to us, didn't they?
No, they belonged to the Chilean people. And of course, the people who owned Kennecott Copper and Anaconda Copper didn't want that to happen. They went to Nixon, said, help us out. Nixon said, fine. He sent the CIA to destabilize the Chilean government. There's a bloody coup. Salvador Allende is assassinated. The Nixon regime, Henry Kissinger, all of them, their blood all over their hands. And they install one of the world's most notorious war criminals, Augusto Pinochet, who was our boy, quote unquote. This is not fabrication. This is real. This can be tested by anyone at any time. Look at, for example, another example would be Vietnam. Now, whatever you think about Vietnam, all right, certainly a disputed war on many fronts, all right? The French were there before we were there. The Japanese were there before the French were there during World War II. And the Chinese were fighting the Vietnamese for the past 2,000 years before that. The Vietnamese have been fighting for a long time. The point here is that while I would get into a more detailed history of Vietnam, I would simply state at this point that you can't make someone free if you're bombing them into the Stone Age. And that's what General Curtis LeMay stated we did from 1965 to 1968. We dropped a total tonnage of bombs every 3 days equal to the Hiroshima bomb dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. You can't make people free if you're killing them. I'm sorry, you know.
But I mean, it seems in the case of the latest adventure, Iraq,
I was getting to
and
that.
Afghanistan, I mean, the United States attitude is, well, we're going to go ahead and do the same thing again.
Well, let me come back to that. That's the one older one that I wanted to talk about. If you go back into the deep, dark early 50s, you come upon 1953, and there is a democratically elected progressive leftist leader named Mossadegh. And the British don't like what Mossadegh is up to. He's going to nationalize some of British holdings in that part of the world. The British got control of that part of the world in some deals with Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, the big three. I have documentation on that too. But they got control of that part of the world. And the British came to Eisenhower and said, can you help us get rid of Mossadegh? Eisenhower, much to many people's amazement, agreed. And he sent the CIA. We got rid of Mossadegh, and we installed the Shah of Iran. And he was there for 20 years. And at the end of his reign, the Iranian people revolted and installed a right-wing, fundamentalist Muslim government led by the Ayatollah Khomeini, at the same time taking the Americans hostages during that same period. So in a perverse kind of way, we are responsible for the instability and the Islamic fundamentalist government that now rules Iran. All right? We created that by getting rid of Mossadegh in 1953. Without understanding history, it is impossible to understand anything. It will not happen. But let's get back to we have freedom, and now we have all these examples of unfreedom. All right, you have Chile, Vietnam, Iran with Mossadegh, Arbenz in Guatemala, 1954. I can go on like this, but it's really not necessary. Again,
well, not only that, but I mean, how many people in the United States even know about this?
Hardly anyone. My students know nothing about this. They've never heard about it. If I can do an aside, I guess I'll do it. The United States has basically gotten away with a whole lot of distortion through a fear tactic that was known basically as the global communist conspiracy. Now, after the demise of the Soviet Union, it became much more difficult to maintain that global communist conspiracy and use it as a smokescreen. But what most people don't really fully understand, and none of my students, and it wasn't in my history books either, no one knows that the United States, with England, France, a few other Western nations, invaded the Soviet Union in 1917 to try to put down the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, I'm not saying this in support of a one-party, top-down, Marxist-Leninist system. I disagree with that system. But I also disagree with the United States or France or any other nation invading a sovereign nation to try to stop what's going on in that country led by those people dealing with their business. Now, there's an article written by William Appleman Williams It is unbelievably well documented. I show it to my students. They cannot believe their eyes that American soldiers were on the soil of the Soviet Union in 1917. All right? Nobody knows this, but it is true. But it is real. Everyone thinks that the Cold War starts after World War II, when Stalin rushes across out of the borders of the Soviet Union right up to what Winston Churchill in '46 says an Iron Curtain has descended across Europe. What nobody really knows is that this Iron Curtain that everyone that Churchill is talking about was, in fact, I don't know if this camera or what camera can see it, was set up by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. It says Yalta in 1985, Cold City, an enduring symbol. This comes from the New York Times, Tuesday, February 12th, 1985. The caption reads...
Just hold it up there. Like that.
The caption reads, Roosevelt with Churchill and Stalin at their meeting at the Levadia Palace at Yalta in February 1945. 40 years later, 1985, the Yalta Agreement remains a focus for the sharp divisions between East and West in Europe. In fact, what these guys do, and it's even more explicit here, is that the big three divide up Europe before the World War II is over. Here's a picture of the meeting with Churchill, Truman, because Roosevelt has died, and Stalin. This comes from the New York Times Book Review. This is 10 years before this, March 1975, and this is the picture. The caption, I need to turn it over. Okay. The caption is what is so telling. Meeting at Potsdam. And under the picture, here, but it's on this side of the page, it says how Truman, Stalin, and Churchill saved the world from peace. Nobody knows that that Iron Curtain, quote unquote, that Churchill said has descended. He organized that Iron Curtain with Roosevelt and with Stalin. It was all organized. It was all set up before the end of World War II. No one knows this. No one has any idea of this. And without understanding that, you can never understand the Cold War. Stalin did not start the Cold War. Stalin is a brutal butcher, dictator, one-party state, contemptible. There is, the Soviet Union was a class system in every sense of the word, all right? But he did not start the Cold War. We did. And history documents that. And it is impossible to try to explain anything to anybody unless they understand some history. Now, let me get back to my equality, democracy, and freedom, because I need to basically explain how it is that people sleep at night. All right? These contradictions don't seem to keep people awake. All right? They don't seem to worry about them. All right? Yes, some of them are at the shopping malls. They've lost themselves in consumerism. But the column that we need is an aspect of ideological hegemony that Gramsci discussed, and he called it common sense, hence the title of my book, The Hegemony of Common Sense. The subtitle is Wisdom and Mystification in Everyday Life. So what does this mean? Well, this is quite politically incorrect, what I'm now going to say. But if you have the promise of equality, and if you have the reality of inequality, common sense has a ready-made answer for that. It explains away that contradiction, not in any fundamental sense, but in enough of a way that you can sleep. You can say, oh, well, that's why women are less equal than men, is because they're going to have babies. They don't need to be paid as much as men because they're not going to stay with the farm. So we don't have to, that's why women make less money than men. What does common sense say about Afro-Americans? See, In these politically correct times, people have learned to keep their mouths shut, but that doesn't mean that they're not thinking these things. All right? And common sense would say about Afro-Americans, it would, these are, forgive me, Arnold, these are true lies, quote unquote, all right? These are bits of wisdom that are actually untrue. They are plausible fictions. Common sense would say about people of color, or they're lazy, or they're shiftless, or the premier one is that they have lower IQs. Start with Jensen and Shockley, all the way up through Herrnstein, then the bell curve. All of these are supposedly scientific, documented reasons why people of color are lower down on their socioeconomic level than are white people. Not that white people can't be discriminated against, they can. No one has a monopoly on discrimination. Discrimination is discrimination. It can happen to anyone. Meaning, I don't believe in reverse discrimination. I simply believe that discrimination exists and it's illegal. But common sense provides a ready-made answer that abolishes that contradiction between the promise of equality and the reality of inequality. What about democracy? The promise of democracy, you have Watergate, you have Iran-Contra, you have Bush being selected by the Supreme Court. What does common sense say about politics and politicians? It says they're all corrupt. It's a dirty business. You can't fight City Hall. Why are you getting so upset? Chill out. Go have a beer. It's over. The argument, the discussion is ended. And what also dies with the use of common sense is the ability for people to exercise their capacities to think critically.
So this ideology you're saying of common sense,
yes,
is an ideology really of accepting oppression.
Yes, but you participate in it. You see, it's not brainwashing. You search through your mind to find an answer that will basically absolve this contradiction, get rid of it. All right? If it was brainwashing, it would be much easier to fight. But it's not brainwashing. I don't know particular common sense of subcultural groups. I've never had the position at a school where I had the time and the money to do that research. What I do know is general common sense.
But I mean, in this society today in the United States, for example, the propaganda has been that America is the greatest country in the world, and that you have all kinds of possibilities here that you don't have in other countries. You can become a millionaire, you can become a billionaire, and yet the reality that workers are facing in the United States is that living conditions, their economic situation is not as good as their parents, and their children's future is not good.
Well,
and that must be, that reality it must be more and more evident to people. So these common things, is that, are they going to get people to accept that?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Common sense is fluid, multiform, flexible. It ranges from a continuum. On one side you have helplessness, hopelessness, rootless surrender, probably clinical depression. On the other side you have periodic militant rebellion or militant activism, and in the middle you have the dominant modality, which is apathy, cynicism, and indifference. And that's where most people live. But let's get back to freedom, because this is a killer. And I'll finish what you started a minute ago. Not only are we taught that the United States is the best and most powerful nation that has ever existed in the United States, we are also taught that whatever problems exist in the United States can be remedied by simply voting in different people. All right? And further, we are taught that whenever revolution occurs, it always produces more harm than good.
Except the American Revolution.
Well, like I said, that's not a revolution. It is a war of national liberation. So given that this is the best of all possible worlds, as Dr. Pangloss might say in Voltaire's Candide, and given that whatever changes are necessary can be accomplished simply by voting in different people. And given that whenever revolution occurs, it's always a bad thing, you owe your allegiance to this system as it presently exists. All right. That is powerful, and when I say that, most of my students say, yes, they've heard that. And I said, how did I know that you've heard that? I mean, I didn't grow up around your dinner table. And I said, I know that because I've been to the library, I've been to graduate school. Mainly, I've thought about these things and I've studied. And it's very clear that these are root ideas that basically, if you buy those ideas, quote unquote, if you subscribe to those ideas as the dominant class would like you to, the owners of the multinational corporations, you're under their thumb. They've won. They're in control. Without police, without armies being used, you keep yourself in line. Now let's talk about freedom. This is the most interesting and the most amazing bit of historical legerdemain that I've ever come across. Remember that the notion of capitalist freedom, and that's what we really need. We're talking about capitalist equality and capitalist democracy and capitalist freedom. We're not talking about something abstract, equality, or abstract democracy, or abstract freedom. No, we need to concretize these. We need to historicize these. And so we're talking about capitalist equality, capitalist democracy, capitalist freedom. Let's talk about capitalist freedom. This is great. Think about this. In capitalism, people are compelled to sell their labor voluntarily. I'll say it again. In capitalism, people are compelled to sell their labor voluntarily. What are the two words compelled and voluntary doing together in the same sentence? Well, it's really very simple. That capitalist freedom has only to do with political and legal dimensions. Yes, you're freer than a slave. You're freer than a serf. You can quit your job. A slave couldn't, a serf couldn't, not easily.
And that's what the bosses say, that you can quit your job. If you don't like it, go someplace else.
That's the voluntary aspect. But as soon as you quit your job, what do you have to go then do?
Sell your labor?
Yes, you have to get another job. And that's the compulsion. So this is the only period of history that I know of where freedom, the actual content of freedom, is compulsion. That capitalism doesn't even deliver on its own content of freedom. You are compelled to sell your labor voluntarily. Right? You can quit your job, but after you quit your job, you got to go find another one. And you are compelled to sell your labor power, to sell your labor. That means that freedom is a lie. And that's what, not just Bush, but the entire imperium of America, the entire system of America has gotten away with exporting that around the world. And it's only after that Nike comes to Indonesia and the people end up making Nike shoes that cost $150 here, and they get paid something like 25 cents, 50 cents an hour, something absurd. It's only after 10, 15, 20 years that some of these countries start to fight back. They start to elect the Allendes, to elect the Mossadeqs, to elect the Hugo Chavez's. Now, whether I like these people or don't like these people is really immaterial, because the people in those countries like those people. It's their country. It's not my country. And what the United States got away with doing, because no one knew the history of the Cold War, is that whenever the people in those countries stood up for their rights and fought back, we said that this fight was caused or manipulated from Moscow.
But isn't that the corporate media? I mean, you have the TV, the radio, which has a continual corporate blitz propagandizing an ideology. The ideology that you have to protect democracy in Iraq, the ideology that we do have democracy here, we have freedom.
Right, but it's true. But it's not just the media. It's deeper than that. It happens around the water cooler at the workplace. It happens in the schoolyard with your friends. The most powerful place that capitalist ideology, capitalist culture reproduces itself is in everyday life. That's the factory that generates the power of ideological hegemony and common sense. And to finish my thought is that when people fight back, and they do, for decades and decades we said the corporate media and others, schoolyards, teachers, education, churches, you name it, this is the international communist conspiracy. And that then gave us the right, quote unquote, to send the CIA or send the Marines. And people said that, this is the common sense, anything is necessary to stop communism. Right? United States defends freedom around the world. You kill Allende, you get rid of Mossadegh.
And that's the common sense of the United States.
That's the common sense. Anything is necessary to stop communism. Now, what is emerging now, given that they no longer have communism to kick around, is terrorism.
And we can't go into that because we're at the end of the discussion, but the book is The Hegemony of Common Sense, Wisdom, and Mystification of Everyday Life. I want to thank you for coming tonight, Dean, and we'll have to have you back to go into depth more on this subject.
I would love to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.